Chapter 13. Now we're on to the nervous system. So chapter 13 is really more the histology of the nervous system, and then we're going to talk about the brain, which is chapter 16, and then we're going to go back and talk about the spinal cord, which is chapter 14, and then we'll do the sensory system, which is chapter 18, and that will be it for this neural unit. Okay. So in chapter 19, we're going to talk about the endocrine system. So that's chapter 19. And the endocrine system is hormones, right? Endo, meaning secreting cells that are glandular cells that are secreting hormones into your blood. And they make things happen. And the nervous system makes things happen. But the nervous system is the immediate system, right? So when you need things to happen immediately, you go to the nervous system. When you want things to happen over time, more like housekeeping stuff, then it's the endocrine system. Both of them control and adjust activities within your body. It's just the nervous system is an immediate system where you want things to start and stop quickly. Whereas the endocrine system, it's really hard to start and stop it quickly because you're releasing hormones into the blood and then travels to target organs. And so this takes time. And so it's hard to start and stop quickly. So it's slower to act, but lasts for a much longer period than the nervous system. We'll talk about the endocrine in chapter 19. Right now, we're going to focus on the nervous system. So you have the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So you've probably recognized that we are in anatomy splitting things into more the axis and the other stuff outside the axis. And so the central nervous system is like the axial part, and the rest is more appendicular. There is the autonomic nervous system. We don't talk too much about that, but it's the sympathetic and parasympathetic. And so this is really like the fight or flight, and this is the rest and digest, right? So parasympathetic. Now the central nervous system is your brain and spinal cord. And the peripheral nervous system is everything outside the brain and spinal cord. So we'll get into that a little bit more in subsequent chapters. But really you have to look at it. The peripheral nervous system has sensory receptors and that send information into the brain. And it also has motor neurons and glandular neurons, right? So it makes things happen. Central nervous system is really the brain. That's the main component, and the brain really is responsible for taking in all sensory information from the periphery, processing it, coordinating it, and forming some kind of integration and deciding what the motor output in response to all that sensory information that's coming in. It's also where the seat of intelligence, memory, learning, emotions, it's really who you are, right? So everything that you're thinking, remembering, doing is being integrated in the central nervous system. I mean, you kind of have to think about your brain as a computer. So babies are born with blank computers. Except for a few reflexes, they don't have much input into their brain. And as babies grow and develop and experience things, that programs the brain. And so no two brains are programmed the same. Even if you have several siblings in your house, you grew up differently from one another. Your experiences are different. For example, if you're a firstborn, your experiences and the way your parents behave is going to be very different than if you're the third or fourth child. Parents just can't help it. They're also learning and developing as they have different kids, and they behave differently. You have different friends, you have different teachers, you have different aptitudes and heights and all kinds of things. So all of these experiences are getting programmed in your brain, and that affects the way your brain processes and sees things and interprets sensory coming in. And so that sensory coming in is really coming from the peripheral nervous system. So that is called the afferent sensory system of the peripheral nervous system. And it can be coming from your muscles, joints, skin, which is somatic, or it can be coming from your visceral organs. The efferent is the motor out part of your brain. I'm sorry, of the peripheral nervous system. So the brain decides things and sends motor commands out to skeletal muscles. It could be cardiac, smooth muscle, and it could be glands to secrete things. Stuff, a very scientific word, stuff. So the somatic nervous system is for skeletal muscles only. So somatic nervous system refers to skeletal muscles. And the autonomic nervous system refers to cardiac, smooth muscle, and glands. And then the autonomic nervous system can be further divided again into parasympathetic, which is rest and digest, and sympathetic, which is fight or flight. So it's kind of thinking about it like, parasympathetic is active when you eat, when you're resting, when you're reading. Sympathetic is active when you're exercising, when you're scared, stressed. So they kind of do the exact opposites. So the Afferent Division, which again is sensory in to central nervous system, is bringing sensory information into the central nervous system so your brain can process it, right? Can interpret or process sensory info. It begins at receptors that are in the periphery. This is different than the efferent division. It carries motor commands to muscles and glands, and it ends at an effector. An effector is the thing that gets the motor command from your brain, right? So effectors, again, are going to be skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. So this just kind of, again, shows you central nervous system, brain, and spinal cord. It's always going to be sensory information in, motor out. Sensory in, motor out. Super important to understand that, because when we get to the peripheral nervous system, it's the afferent sensory system, which begins at receptors. And that's sending, those receptors are getting excited by some kind of stimulus and sending that sensory information into the central nervous system. What comes out of the central nervous system is called the afferent motor out division. And it can either be somatic nervous system, which goes to skeletal muscles, or autonomic nervous system, which goes to visceral glands and smooth cardiac muscles. So if you haven't gotten the memo, Do you need to know the Afferent Division? Absolutely. So this is really important to understand. Right? You need to understand the how the nervous system is set up. You have sensory information that starts at sensory receptors. They could be somatic sensory receptors, joints, skeletal muscles, skin. These are going to be general sensory receptors. Pain, pressure, touch, vibration, temperature, joint angle, tendon length. I mean, they're all somatic sensory receptors. Visceral sensory receptors are going to be cardiac, smooth muscle glands, and these receptors are monitoring things. You have also special sensory receptors, photoreceptors of the eye. You have the olfactory receptors in the nose. You have taste buds or gustatory receptors in the tongue, the cochlea and the semicircular canals and vestibule of the ear for balance, equilibrium, and hearing. So these are special sensory organs, but all of them are receiving sensory input, right? Or stimulus, and sending what are called action potentials. Into central nervous system. So it starts at receptors in the periphery and sends this sensory information into the central nervous system. That is the afferent division. The efferent division, again, is motor out. And so that's sending a command to either muscles, could be skeletal muscles, smooth muscles, or glands. And so it goes through somatic nervous system, which is skeletal muscles, and autonomic nervous system, which can be sympathetic or parasympathetic. Here's a nice little schematic drawing. Know this. It's all the same info, right? So understand, sensory begins at receptors. Right? They respond to stimuli. They're all specific to specific types of stimuli, and send action potentials into sensory into the central nervous system. So that's the sensory afferent division. The receptors can be special receptors, somatosensory receptors, or visceral sensory receptors. What leaves the central nervous system is going to be a motor command of the efferent division. And again, somatic nervous system is skeletal muscle. And autonomic nervous system, which is cardiac or smooth muscle and glands. And it could be parasympathetic or sympathetic. All of these things are effectors. Skeletal muscles are effectors, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands, they're effectors. A couple of other terms to kind of wrap your head around is that in the brain, the outer layer, and this is in all anatomy, the outer layer is always called the cortex. And the brain has a cerebral cortex, and you're going to hear the terms gray matter and white matter. Gray matter are the cell bodies. Oops, I'm about to spell bodies wrong. The cell bodies of the neurons. And white matter are going to be the myelinated axons of those neurons. And so we'll talk about white matter in a minute, but the neural cortex is gray matter. You have centers where there are groups of cell bodies that share a common function, like the visual center or the auditory center. Nucleuses, this is not like the nucleus of a cell. These are all nuclei here. They are collections of cell bodies, right? So these gray areas of nucleus are collections of cell bodies. Now tracks columns, these are white matter. And these are the axons. So they're the axons. Let me keep it simple here. Axons of neurons. And they have this waxy coating that's called myelin, and it looks white. So those are tracks and columns. These are going to be the axons. Ganglions, this is a collection of the cell bodies of a sensory neuron outside the central nervous system, and you see these in the sensory neurons going into the spinal cord. A nerve, by the way, most nerves are what are called mixed nerves, which contain the axons of sensory and motor neurons. So they're mixed. They have sensory axons that are bringing sensory information in, and they have motor axons all bundled together. Motor axons bringing commands out. So looking at these, talk about a neuron. So we have neurons. They're the basic functional cell of the nervous system. And so this kind of goes through basic functional cell, right? And there are sensory neurons and there are motor neurons. So I was talking about sensory neurons. These are carrying sensory information to the central nervous system. Motor neurons carrying motor commands away from the central nervous system. And then there are support cells. These support cells are called neuroglial cells or glial cells. There are 4 different types in the central nervous system and 2 types in the peripheral nervous system. So we'll talk about those glial cells in a minute. Moving over here, again, gray matter. It's the cell bodies of the neurons. White matter is going to be the myelinated axons of those neurons. Now, looking at a basic neuron, there is a cell body. The cell body is called a soma, and off the soma are these extensions called dendrites. And these extensions are for connections to other neurons. So the dendrites can receive stimulus from other neurons so they can intercommunicate. The axon of the cell body is generally myelinated. It has a membranous kind of waxy coating around the axon, and this helps speed up the transmission of the electrical impulse from the cell body to the end of the axon, called the axon terminal. Other categories, again, we talked about receptors. You need to know these definitions. And if I could write, that would be lovely. No definitions. Right? No definitions. Know what receptors are. Know what effectors are. I've talked about this several times. Reflexes, haven't mentioned this, but a reflex is a stimulus that elicits the exact same response every time. So you can have a rapid stimulus, and that stimulus will have the same motor output every time. It doesn't vary. Other functional terminologies, again, somatic, visceral, voluntary and involuntary, subconscious, and then I mentioned action potentials. You get to learn a lot more about action potentials in physiology, but for now it's just an electrical current that gets generated in an area around the soma, and if that electrical current travels down the axon to the axon terminal and will cause either a muscle to contract or another neuron to become excited. An example of that would be when we talked about the neuromuscular junction, and the motor neuron had action potential generated, and it would release acetylcholine on the neuromuscular junction on the motor end plate and so forth. So I know you've heard the term action potential, and we'll get into that more in physiology. Okay, so said there's neurons. Those are the basic functional cells, and we talked about the parts of it. We didn't really talk about perikaryon. That is the intracellular fluid in a neuron. And then neuroglial cells we'll talk about in a minute. So here's the parts of the basic neuron. And the axon hillock is where really the action potential is generated if there's enough stimulus to that cell body, dendrites, and so forth. The axon terminal, again, are at the ends of the axon, and it could be a motor axon or a sensory axon. Neuroglial cells, this is going to be the central nervous system, and this is the peripheral nervous system, and there are 4 different types of neuroglial cells or glial cells in the central nervous system. I like to say the ependymal cells, they kind of look like squid because these create liquid, cerebral spinal fluid. So ependymal cells line the ventricles, and we'll get to the ventricles in chapter 16. But these ependymal cells line the ventricles, and along with the cerebral capillaries create something called cerebral spinal fluid. And that cerebral spinal fluid is what kind of monitors and nourishes and cleanses the neurons. The second type are microglial. They are bacteria eating. So they kind of look like little microorganisms. I don't know, they draw them like these little fuzzy microorganisms. So these are phagocytotic. They kind of destroy bacteria in the central nervous system. Astrocytes kind of look like asteroids, right? So these little guys kind of have this asteroid look to it. And these are really creating a structure. So these are structural, and they also regulate ions, nutrients, dissolved gases. They kind of recycle neurotransmitters, can help after there's damage. So they're kind of like the all-around structural support for the central nervous system. And then remember I talked about that white matter myelination. That in the central nervous system is created by the oligodendrocytes. They myelinate the axons of the central nervous system, neurons, and one oligodendrocyte can myelinate several axons. So if that's one axon, there's 2, it can myelinate several axons. On the peripheral side, you only have the satellite cells and the Schwann cells. So the Schwann cells create myelination. So Schwann cells create the white matter, and that white matter is the myelination. And the myelination is what helps the action potential travel down that axon quickly. Multiple sclerosis, MS, that is where the Schwann cells have an issue creating this myelination. And so the action potential is generated in your central nervous system to move your muscles, but that action potential doesn't quite get to the very end, to the neuromuscular junction. If there's no myelination, that signal just kind of dies out. So these Schwann cells are super important. Satellite cells kind of are structural, and they help regulate ions and neurotransmitter levels, and they're kind of support cells as well. So this kind of goes through the central nervous system, the 4 different glial cells. Here's my old kind of cheat sheet that I have a slide on that goes through astrocytes and oligodendrocytes and microglial and ependymal. So I tried to show you what each one looks like here. Peripheral nervous system, you have satellites and Schwann cells, and again goes through their basic functions. So myelination in the peripheral axons, these Schwann cells kind of wrap around the axon and then rotates around and around and around and creates this myelin coating. So you can see here, it's this kind of thick myelin coating. And so it's kind of like insulating speaker wire or wire that's connecting your television to Apple TV, right? An HDMI cable. The better the insulation, the faster the transmission of the signal, so it has a higher speed of uploading and downloading, and the quality of that signal is better with better myelination. So these Schwann cells are very important in signal regulation. Again, so the neural lemma is the cell membrane, and the axolemma is the cell membrane in the axon. Perikaryon, again, is the cytoplasm. Axon hillock is where that action potential is generated, and so forth. These are just definitions. Teleodendria are on the dendrites, either further extensions. And then we talked about axon terminals here at the very end. And by the way, we get to synapses in physiology, but a synapse is where the neuron can communicate with a postsynaptic cell, which is either a muscle or a gland or another neuron. Structural classification and functional classification. So structure is just based on the number of processes extending from the cell body. Functional is going to be whether it's sensory motor or interneurons, which are completely in central nervous system. Structural, if it's an axonic, anaxonic, it's found only in the central nervous system. They're interneurons, and they're very specific. Bipolar is unique. You see these in the retina of the eye. Pseudo-unipolar, these are going to be sensory, and multipolar are going to be motor, generally speaking. And so they kind of look like this. I don't really test you on the structure, but it's good to understand, like, this is a ganglion usually. The cell body ends up in a ganglion of these sensory nerves. And then the multipolar neurons are the motor neurons, right? This is what sensory look like. And so you have sensory, motor, and interneurons. Sensory neurons are afferent. They always begin at receptors, and they are sending information from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system. Now, they could be monitoring the internal environment. They could be monitoring skin, joints, external environment. They could also be monitoring muscle length and tendon tension. So that's called proprioception. But they're all monitoring, and they're sending the sensory in. Interneurons then are going to interpret, and then whether it sends a command out to the skeletal muscles, which would be somatic, right? Here, that's somatic. Or visceral, motor, which would then be smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, and adipocytes. So this goes through motor. Again, motor can be autonomic or somatic. Autonomic, again, is going to have sympathetic and parasympathetic. Interneurons are in the central nervous system, and these are the ones that analyze all the sensory data coming in and decide what matters and what doesn't matter. And then they coordinate the motor outputs. So it's important to understand that these are always, for the most part, going to be excitatory, but interneurons can be excitatory or inhibitory because certain sensations coming in can be inhibited by interneurons if they're just deemed to not be a threat to the human or the animal. So it gets really complicated. Cell bodies of neurons, so the soma or cell body does not regenerate. So that's why you wear helmets. That's why you don't want a spinal cord injury, because the cell bodies of these neurons are located in your brain and in your spinal cord. What goes out of the brain or spinal cord are called nerves. And those nerves are really just axons. And an axon can be damaged, like in this drawing. And those axons can grow back if the cell body is still healthy and intact. So that's why people that have nerve damage can regain that function, whether it's a motor nerve or a sensory nerve, mixed nerve. If there's damage to the nerve, it can grow back. And so this kind of shows you how those Schwann cells are involved in helping a nerve regenerate, the axon of the nerve regenerate. But cell bodies are not regenerative. So if those cell bodies go in the central nervous system, then you lose function altogether. Real quick on action potentials. Action potentials are ions moving across a membrane, and we get into this in physio. So you don't need to worry about it now. But this movement of ions across a membrane is energy, right? And so this energy is what excitability is. And so anything that can allow these ions to move across the membrane is called a stimulus. So there are different kinds of receptors, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in 18, and we'll talk more about that in physiology. But a stimulus is something that has to move enough ions across the membrane to overcome what is called threshold. And if enough ions move across the membrane to hit threshold, then an action potential is created, and that action potential is electrical current that travels all the way down the axon, if it's properly myelinated, down to axon terminal. So the speed of this action potential moving down the axon to the axon terminal really has a lot to do with the presence of myelin, this myelin sheet around the axon. And so heavily myelinated axons that are also large in diameter are fastest. And the smaller the diameter, you got to think of it like a freeway or a highway. If you have 2 lanes, so a 2-lane road, you can only go so fast in a car. But if you have a 12-lane road, chances are you can drive faster, right? Because there's more lanes available. And so bigger diameters, which one's going to be the faster propagator, A or B? Hopefully you're saying B. B is going to be faster because faster diameter, bigger diameter is faster. If the diameter gets smaller and or it lacks myelin, it's going to really be a slow transmission of impulse. So a neuron, again, can synapse on another neuron, it can synapse on a muscle, and it can synapse on a gland. And these synapses are chemical synapses, meaning they release neurotransmitters, which are really these amino acid proteins that are created by the DNA in the nucleus of the soma or neuron cell body. And these neurotransmitters are the chemical communicators. Occasionally you can have gap junctions like in the heart muscle, and that electrical current can jump from one cell to another, but it's not very common. So an action potential is going to travel down, and when that action potential reaches the axon terminals, it's going to then release neurotransmitter from the axon vesicles. That neurotransmitter is going to travel across what is called the synaptic cleft, which is this area between the axon terminal and the postsynaptic structure, which is this, whatever. Postsynaptic can be a muscle, it can be a gland, it can be another neuron. And that neurotransmitter is going to bind to receptors on the postsynaptic membrane, and that's going to cause an action potential to be generated in the postsynaptic structure. Or it can be inhibitory, right? So it doesn't always have to be excitatory, but it results in, if it's excitatory, an action potential in the next neuron or in the skeletal muscle if it's a neuromuscular junction. Again, this is physio, so don't freak out, but I'm previewing it for you. So just kind of to recap, things that matter, right? Understanding in this chapter: central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, afferent division, and efferent divisions, right? So sensory and motor, and then understanding, you know, the difference between gray matter and white matter, and the different organization of these cells. Neural circuits are created throughout life. And if you don't use a neural circuit, just like your skeletal muscles, if you don't use them continuously, you kind of lose muscle mass. If you don't use a neural circuit continuously, it really stops communicating. Those neurons stop communicating with each other. And so it's kind of the use it or lose it. And that's why, you know, certain things, and certain times that you actually form those neural circuits. When you form neural circuits at a young age, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, those neural circuits actually overly release neurotransmitter on one another. And so they form a stronger synapse with one another. And so they basically have a stronger connection. As you age, you release less neurotransmitter. It's less of a synapse from one exposure versus when you're young. And that's why you remember, quote, remember things better when you're younger versus when you get older. There's like a learning period that's very strong. And I have a great podcast if you guys are interested. I think I might have even assigned it in a discussion. But I have some really great podcasts on why we learn things better, for better or worse, when we're younger and we remember things. So that's it for chapter 13. The next one I'm going to be doing is chapter 16, and then we will move on to 14 and